Hello. Thank you very much for joining me on another episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D. So, in this particular series, we've been talking about some of the mental health crises facing Americans. We've been talking about how part of that is issues of loneliness and disconnection. In our last video, we talked about connectedness needs and our hope globally that we can start ameliorating those needs, that we can make these things better by participating in relationships differently. So in this episode, I'd like to talk to you about transformative relationships and some of the literature that I've read and some of my own understanding of this. So pull up a chair, let's hang out for a minute as we talk about transformative relationships. So transformative relationships, to define them, looking across various sources of literature on the subject, are the kinds of relationships that promote well-being for all involved. The kind of relationship that doesn't just promote our well-being in the short run, but promotes our well-being in the long run as well. That after years of having had this relationship or abiding in this relationship, that we are better for having had this relationship than otherwise. And of course, if it's transformative, it's almost always mutually transformative. And therefore, the person who helped transform us is likely benefited by this relationship as well. So what are some characteristics of transformative relationships? So according to the work of Robertson, and hopefully we'll remember to put the link to this article down below, the characteristics of transformative relationships are compassion, engagement, presence, authenticity, and power or respect. So when we think about how it is that compassion is transformative, the more we think about it, the more it illuminates itself, to the point where it can often feel redundant to talk about how it is that compassion is transformative, but I'm going to exercise redundancy for a moment. Compassion is motivated empathy. I'd like to say that again. Compassion is motivated empathy. Empathy is just feeling what somebody else feels, okay, or understanding what someone else feels would be a better way to put it. Compassion is when it matters to you, where you're going to do something about it. One of my favorite philosophers is a Russian philosopher by the name of Mikhail Bakhtin. And Bakhtin, criticizing psychology, asks a question. He says, if I understand psychologists to be right, empathy is feeling what the other feels. So therefore, if somebody approaches a psychologist and they are crying with despair, the psychologist too would be crying with despair. Who then is helping? And so he asks a question. Maybe we need to rethink the definition of empathy for psychology. And so I would like to assert that's compassion. That compassion is when another is having an experience and how it is that we are motivated to engage with that experience, sometimes to participate in it, and sometimes to ameliorate it, and sometimes both. For example, to participate in it when we are entering into a particular situation and it is fun and lovely and lively. Compassion is engaging with the emotion of enthusiasm, of happiness, of engagement, and persisting that and perpetuating that. For example, last night, my wife and I and a few of our kids were in a movie talking about a Studio Ghibli film that we had just watched in theaters. And compassion is perpetuating that, engaging in that particular conversation. The inside jokes, the wondering about the symbolism and the engagement of meaning and the themes around culture and experience, etc., that arose in our discourses around the film, right? That's compassion. That empathy is everybody here is having fun and everybody here is happy. Compassion is motivated, right, to participate in that. Likewise, when it comes to amelioration. One day, for example, my youngest son was running across the yard. He was a toddler at the time, and he tripped and fell. And as he tripped and fell, there was that crisis moment he had where he looked at old Dad, and I'm sitting there on the porch, about how I would respond. And so I knew that he had skinned his little hands and his little knees. And so I went, "Oh, wow, you did it. You can jump right up again." Even though I was worried about his pain because I wanted to ameliorate the situation. So sure enough, he jumps up, he looks at little scrapes on his hands and knees and dusts them off and runs and plays, right? He's laughing the entire time. if I had freaked out in that moment, if I'd gotten very more, oh no, poor baby, then it would have added a lot more suffering to that particular moment than was needful. And so instead, by kind of bracketing my concern for his welfare and then participating, oh wow, you slept, okay, that's so cool, you can get up and run, that I was interested in ameliorating the moment of his little scrapes, right? Likewise, that's what many of my colleagues who are therapists do. They very compassionately dive deep with their clients into suffering and try to find a way to pull people out of the depths. I'd like to argue sometimes, though, it's both. Sometimes compassion is joining with someone, and in joining with them, it doesn't make the problem go away, and yet it was a transformational experience for them. A friend of mine sent me a little picture by an unknown author that said, "Your comforting silence is worth more than 1,000,000 empty words." That sometimes just being with people, it doesn't necessarily make the suffering go away. When we're really willing to get in the mud with them, that they will feel comforted and the meaning of the mud can transform. For example, many years ago, I had a supervisor by the name of Beverly. I was blessed in my career with many amazing supervisors, and I hope to praise them in this video series because they are very worthy of praise, even if they don't believe that they are. And Beverly had an art. I was working full-time, going to school full-time. My beloved was giving birth to our eldest child. I was stretched so thin. I was so tired and so demoralized. And when I would go in to meet with Beverly Alexander to talk about my clients and the work that I was doing with them, Beverly would instead get in the mud with me. And she would just sit and empathize and validate how hard it is to be in the stage of development that I was. And it didn't make that stage of development go away. I was still tired. I was still demoralized. And yet I made it through another day because somebody else was willing to sit in the mud with me. Likewise, my sweetheart is a fixer. She loves fixing things, and she is so good at fixing things. Like, she bought me an electric car the other day, and rather than hiring an electrician to run the line, she YouTube and checking with other electricians and manuals, etc., figured out how to install and run a 220-volt line so I can charge my car. She loves fixing things. And it's been so meaningful in our marriage that when I am hurting, when I'm upset, when I'm suffering, that she's gotten very good at just slowing down and sitting in the mud. As the tears fall down my face and into the dust of our fallen world, and it creates the mud of being, she just sits in it with me, just rubs my back. Right? So these are transformative relationships. These are one of the key characteristics, thank you, of transformative relationships, is that we have motivated empathy. So engagement. Engagement is the activity that we participate in when we are taking the other person up for their own sake. That when they're talking to us, we're focusing on what it is that they are saying and where it is that they are coming from. Here in another video, we'll talk about listening to understand rather than listening to respond. Engagement is when we listen to understand, where we're really trying to get where the other person is coming from. To engage is transformative for us because we really get another viewpoint and another idea of where it is that somebody else is coming from. It's also transformative for the other because then they feel that their ideas, their experience is worthy to be engaged with. And so therefore it becomes transformative because the meaning becomes connecting. That as somebody is coming in and talking to me about their day at work, and I listen to them very carefully and I take them seriously, that is a moment of connection, that validates whatever it is they're going through at work and whatever it is that they're struggling with or suffering, as well as informing me about other ways that it's like to live at work. Presence. Presence is being a feature and a characteristic in people's lives. I just keep thinking about, when I think of presence, I think of a few dear friends of mine. I've got a friend out in Washington, a friend in Provo, a friend down in Gallup, friends down in Gallup, and friends all over the world. And I'm very blessed because they are present for me. My family, most of whom lives within 30 miles of where I'm sitting, they're very present, meaning that, like my friend in Washington, for example, Oregon, sorry, my friend, Oregon. When we visit, it's usually on our way to Washington. So my friend in Oregon, she has this nearly psychic ability that when I'm really down and out, I get a text message from her, a phone call from her. And again, it seems almost supernatural until I realize that I too have patterns of communication. And that when I am suffering, I am engaging in the pattern of communication of suffering, even though I'm not intending to show that pattern. And so I've got other friends, for example, every Friday, not every Friday, most Fridays, I go out to breakfast with a dear friend. And just the presence, just her presence, just sitting down and hearing me out, etc., can be very connecting. And of course, my friends in New Mexico, in Gallup area, that as my life has hit a wall, they have always already been there. So just being there for one another, just the presence being a feature in one another's lives. There's an old saying that says that quality time is quantity time is quality time if everybody's getting along, right? And so I think of the ways in which the transformative relationships I've had in life that and continue to have in life, these people have been present in my life. And therefore, I would like to hope I'm present in theirs as well. So authenticity. Authenticity is kind of self-explanatory, that it's not a transformative relationship if we're having to put on masks or play roles or other things while we're engaging with other people. That when we are really who we are in relation to the other, that is where authenticity unfolds, and that's where authenticity is. Now, you notice the way I phrase that. Authenticity isn't, I get to be whoever I am and you have to suck it up and deal with it. That's not necessarily authenticity. Authenticity is, I am who I am, really, actually, in relation to you. So therefore, if we are speaking and we're speaking in a particular way, then you are a part of that authentic relating. For example, I relate authentically differently to my sweetheart than I do to my daughters, for example. Whereas with my sweetheart, we have ways of talking and discoursing, etc., where we're taking one another into account for how it is that we express ourselves as spouses do. When I'm with my kids, I do so as dad. So therefore, it's still me, it's still them, it's still authentic. But what makes it authentic is the unity of self and other, what Martin Buber called the I and thou. And so as we are relating to one another, and we are relating authentically in that relationship, that is transformative. Now, the reason why I had to go on that digression is because, or I felt compelled to go on that digression, is I meet too many people who are like, well, this is just who I am, you have to suck it up and deal. And so they will treat people unfairly, unkindly, aggressively, or rudely, and just say, that's who I authentically am. That is one definition of authenticity. It's very individualistic definition, right? We find that transformative relationships, though, unfold when it is a relational authenticity, meaning I am who I am in relation to you, and you are who you are in relation to me together, and that's where authenticity unfolds in a transformative way. Likewise, respect, an acknowledgement of power, an acknowledgement of worth. There are differences that we have. Last night, for example, on our way to dinner, I was talking to my daughter and my wife, one of my daughters and my wife, about power and privilege. And I was using them synonymously, and my daughter says, well, let's distinguish those. And we talked about the way in which privilege and or power, depending on how we were defining it, exists in relation in certain ways. And what we find in these transformative relationships, when they are positive, if there is a power difference, that somebody invites us into the sharing of power. For example, I had a boss years ago in college. Her name is Jackie. She and I have long ago lost touch. And she was a manager at a gas station where I worked. And I loved that job. It was amazing. I got to talk to people from all walks of life. There was a main thoroughfare, the main street that this gas station was on, divided the upper middle class neighborhood from the lower class neighborhood across the street. And so the kids from the poor part of town would come in to buy their penny candy, and the kids from the rich part of town would come in and fill their cars with gas. Likewise, it was by a major interstate, and so people literally from all over the world could just get off the freeway, get gas, and get back on the freeway again. And Jackie was the best to work for. She shared power. She would ask my opinion about this display or what to do about this particular problem. And it wasn't false or inauthentic. It was real. And so my voice mattered. That doesn't mean that she always followed my advice or that she always agreed with my perspective. Quite the contrary. Sometimes we had our disagreements. She was always very kind about those disagreements. She was an amazing leader. And so ever since, I've tried to be a Jackie as much as I can be. How do I earnestly seek for the opinions of people who work for me? Given that power difference, how do I level that power? How do I show them the respect as people with thoughts and feelings and ideas? And so, how do we come together? Because in a leadership role, those who engage authentically with, by sharing power, the people that they are supposedly leading, they're better leaders because they do so in relation. They walk ahead with the people that work for them rather than bossing them from behind or charging too far ahead. And so, respect is a key characteristic of transformative relationships. So, in our next unit, we're going to talk about living compassion and communicating compassionately. And these are manifestations of and extensions of our idea of transformative relationships. So, I'm hoping you'll join me on the next episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D. Thanks for hanging out with me for